Do this.
We're live. Another conversation for the Rethinking Sex Addiction, Porn Addiction. Why do I say sex addiction?
Yeah,
Rethinking
right.
Porn Addiction.
Yeah.
It falls under the umbrella, right?
Absolutely.
So for those of you who might be joining us for the first time, my name is Nate Bagley. Along the top row, we have Jake Hodson, Hans Hubrick, and then down below we have Kristen Hodson and Doug Braun Harvey, all amazing people. Kristen and Doug are clinicians, and Nate and Jake and Hans are not. We're just normal guys, and we're here to have conversations about pornography. And for the last 4 or 5 weeks, we have spent a lot of time talking or rethinking the word pornography and our connection with pornography and our experiences with pornography. But this show is called Rethinking Porn Addiction, and we haven't talked about the second half of kind of the phrase porn addiction, which is the word addiction. And so this week I thought it'd be fun to kind of like dive in and see what we can unpack around the word addiction. Does that sound good for you guys today?
Yep.
Yeah.
So the way I kind of in the episode description of this, I swear that this conversation happened, or these conversations happened this week. I had the word addiction. I've just been more attuned to it lately because we're having these conversations, and I heard the word addiction come up in conjunction with the word Oreos. Like, I am addicted to Oreos. Somebody said I'm addicted to Netflix. Somebody else said they had a sister who's addicted to heroin. And then I got an email from a guy who told me that he has a really bad porn addiction and needs help. And I noticed that that the word addiction when you're talking about Oreos and the word addiction when you're talking about heroin probably means something a little bit different. Like, we use the same word to mean something slightly different. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to kind of unpack that today. So I'm curious. I'd love to start out asking Jake and Hans, and maybe I'll chime in as well. What experience did you have growing up throughout your life before starting to have these conversations with the word addiction in conjunction with the word pornography? Like, what did you think that meant?
I'm pausing and thinking because I'm trying to recollect what my experience was as a younger Hans. When I think about, and we talked about a definition of porn last week some, when I think about my early experience or exposure or use of porn or sexual imagery, it didn't have a connotation of addiction around it. It was something that I really enjoyed as a young kid. I felt some shame about it because of factors around me. I'm not quite certain I can put a finger on when the thought of addiction started to come into play, but I do remember very distinctly at times in my own use of porn and solo sex or masturbation that it felt compulsive. Like, it felt like it was something that was more than I wanted. I was doing it when I didn't think I should be, or it was causing issues, and it felt like a behavioral problem for me. And at that point, I obviously became really a lot more aware of the idea of porn addiction, or heard the term a lot more. And for sure, at that point, I started to self-identify as a porn addict or having an addiction to the usage of porn. And then over the years since then, I have migrated to a different place. But I certainly, that was, for me, was a very real label that I put on myself for a while, and described, or at the time was the best description of what I had of what some of my behaviors were. I don't know if that got away from what you were asking there, Nate, but that's kind of my recollection of going through the journey of usage of sexual imagery and masturbation in my life.
It's great.
For me, I think the one thing that I kind of remember was sort of the analogy or imagery of a big, heavy chain that wraps around you and binds you and burdens you. And I think for me, in my background, it was about choice, and that, you know, we had things in place to protect us from losing the freedom of choice, right? This thing that we all fought for, which was agency, was the word that was commonly used. And that pornography or usage of, you know, like illicit substances or whatever would chip away at those freedoms and bind you. Essentially, it was a binding agent. And I love that Hans brought up the word compulsion, because that's something that I'm personally doing a little deep dive study into a different realm. And it's interesting to me that we do have this one word, which is this addiction, and it's sort of a blanket word that everyone just throws everywhere, but really it's this full spectrum. And if we looked at our life from more of a compulsion standpoint, of a really like, we're just compelled to do it without even thinking about it, like what causes, what leads up to it, you know, what facilitates it, and what happens afterwards. And then it makes it a little bit more palatable from a ability to confront standpoint, right? Like if I have an addiction, I become, at least for me, I became inherently powerless. If I have a really strong compulsion towards something, it still gives me power and ownership over it, that I can face this compulsion, or I can face this thing that I have, if I'm willing to look at it enough and figure out the puzzle, essentially, to unlock it.
I don't know if it gets back to some more of the essence of your question, but I do remember very distinctly at times hearing, and it was, I heard outside of myself, the repeated message that pornography is as addictive as heroin or drugs, or that if you use pornography, almost without exception, that's how it's going to end up in your life. You're going to be addicted to it so heavily that you can't break away from it, and it's going to ruin everything else in your life. That message was... I
definitely got that message. And then on top of that, I got the message that pornography was like a gateway drug. Mm-hmm. And that you start out looking at pornography, and then what used to do it for you doesn't do it for you anymore. So you have to look for something more graphic and more intense. And then when that doesn't do it for you anymore, you start seeking out like experiences so maybe you go to a massage parlor, or maybe you hire an escort. And then when that doesn't do it for you, it gets to the point like they start talking about like the Ted Bundys, where like you're going to start raping people, and you're going to start like maybe looking at child porn or something that's like really, really graphic and terrible and horrible. And I know that's the fear that I had, is like, wow, looking at this is like exciting, and looking at these sexual images like gets me aroused, and sometimes it's like a world. But when I did it, exactly what you said, Hans, sometimes I felt like it was a little out of control, and I started to get scared that I was going to go down this path of being some crazy sex predator, that pornography, looking at sexual images, would lead me to a place that would basically leave me in a locked up cell where nobody that I loved or admired would ever want to have contact with me again, because I'd done such shameful and terrible things. And that was the narrative that I had. And we kind of talked about the fact that there's no moral floor before. There is a moral floor. But that was like the narrative that I grew up with, and the fear that I had around porn.
So what I hear in all three of the stories, then, to follow up on what you, Nate, Jake, and Hans said, is the word addiction is the place card for that story of degeneracy, loss of all moral floors, kind of this, as Hans described, a kind of isolated, lonely place of, I'm on my own with this, a sense of, these kind of narratives you're given, from, you didn't say where these narratives came from, but they came from believable places. These were, whoever was giving you these narratives, you believed it. These were viable resources of information, and you believed these ideas. And then, so the word addiction fits beautifully with those ideas. It just goes together perfectly. And so the idea of addiction can feel like, yes, that's exactly what I was told was going to happen. And there's no other words for it. That's the language.
Yep.
Looking back, what you said at the end, Doug, really strikes true with me. There wasn't any other language at the time about it. There was no other alternative conversation. There was no other way to address it or talk about it. And so, yeah, I think addiction, it just became, okay, I look at porn, I look at sexual imagery. I do it on a frequent basis. Therefore, I'm an addict. Like they just went together at that point in my life.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the question is that the right word to use? Do you know what I mean?
I think it is the word that currently community culture, that's the word we've been given to describe the lived and felt experiences people have. And there hasn't been opportunity. Like, I heard a lot of ways you were all describing your experience. And like Doug said, that fit the bill. So I look at it and go, I don't know if it's necessarily a right or wrong, but it is a word that is currently being used, and there is an opportunity to explore not only its purpose, but the meaning. I think there can be a lot of attachment, and people need it for a variety of reasons that I hope we continue to unpack. And maybe there are additional words that further describe the experience that, like Jake said, speak to more of what that experience is and provide a different level of hope or path to really address what's going on.
So
can I just say here's the heart of why this show exists. Because if men could just say all the things the three of you said, and they could just talk about it, and it could be something a 19-year-old could talk about, a 25-year-old could talk about it, and it could be, here's my experience, here's what I'm going through, here's what I think about, and people would just listen and be curious and be interested and talk more about it and not be reactive and not, believe that this is the beginning of a degenerate process to perversion. If that wasn't the reaction, we could sort of just have these conversations. And so I think addiction, or even there was the word compulsion added and other things. I think there's this space between our own experience and the label we want to give it. And that's why we're having this show, because I think everybody moves to those labels so fast because it gets to avoid everything we're going to ask the three of you to talk about.
It is. And with that level, it moves right into, like you bring up, let's talk about it. Let's be curious. Let's explore it. Let's make room to just share experience. But we can jump to like intervention and let's shut it down. And there's not the breathing room to just be like, this is my experience.
And so I'm interested in just, going further into this idea of, because you described a sequence you went through where you were just engaging with sexual imagery while you're masturbating, and it's part of your life. And then at some point, these doubts start moving in. I'm doing this in some way that is a conflict for me.
Yeah.
Right. Now, my guess is all of you were completely alone at that moment, and it would have never occurred to you to go talk to anybody about this little disruption you had in your relationship with imagery.
How did you know? Were you there?
Can you talk about that?
Doug was there.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, when you say that,
shoulder angel.
Who am I? What? Not my who am I, but what do I represent? What did you need in the world that you say I needed a Doug? What did you need when you first noticed, I'm a little worried here?
Doug, what you said just a couple minutes ago, you said in 2 or 3 minutes something that back then would have, looking back, could have altered years of struggle and pain and difficulty for me if I could have had conversations like you just talked about what is this? Let's talk about it. Let's talk about what I'm feeling, what I'm experiencing, what I enjoy, what I don't enjoy about it, what the conflict is. All of those things would have been amazing to have been able to talk about. And I love that I get to talk about them now.
Who would you have talked about that with?
That's a great point.
Honestly, go back to like the 90s, right? Or whenever we grew up, and you're already just feeling all of those things, right? Yeah. But yes, it would have been nice, but who would you talk about those things? Like, would you go to your friends? Would you go to your parents? Like, where would you go?
We live in a world where you get to go is somebody who cares about sex addiction. That's the only path we have.
Yeah.
Until you think you have a porn addiction, you're alone. But the minute you have a porn addiction, you've got a place to go. But what I wanted to point out is Hans would have gone to another place if it was there.
Sure.
It's very appealing to him as he looks back on it.
And Hans, you said something that I still think many people crave, and I don't even know if they psychologically give themselves space to think about. You brought up what I like about it. I think there's very little room to discuss or talk about the upside of porn. There's only, you can talk about it as long as it's under the umbrella of this is bad, I don't like it, but to create space for, well, there's an upside. Can we talk about the
There's
upside?
something I enjoy about it.
Yeah, like the
Otherwise,
pleasure of
we
it.
wouldn't do it. If there wasn't an enjoyable aspect of it, we wouldn't do it.
Oh, enjoyable is a little bit of an understatement.
Okay. I don't know the other word. What's the right word, Doug?
Deeply pleasurable,
Yeah.
and like nothing else on the planet.
So, Nate, two things. I love
Yeah.
what your eyes did a minute ago. The smile and the brightness in your eyes was fantastic. Just the enjoyment was awesome to see there. Kristen, the idea of pleasure. So I'm jumping ahead. Maybe I'm taking the conversation in a way that we don't want to go. But as I've been trying to tease apart the idea of what felt addicting about it, or compulsive, or what was that energy that I was repeatedly engaging in it in. It was pleasure. There was pleasure there that was a very strong draw to move towards. And I recognized later, now down the road, I'm gonna throw in a word that maybe you're good or isn't good, but I was using it for a long time as a coping mechanism in my life. Like, I'm sure people use all kinds of stuff. But the idea that there is, like Doug said, incredible pleasure there has to be a part of what we call addiction, doesn't it? I'm curious if that rings true with you guys.
Well, any addiction is associated with pleasure, right?
Yeah.
Like people don't shoot heroin because it feels gross.
Not necessarily though, Nate. And this is where
I don't know. Like, I'm not the clinician here, so.
Well, no, but looking, like, I used to work in a methadone treatment center, and initially people would describe their experiences of it bringing a high, a pleasure, and then they would start to need to use their substance of choice to stay well, and they no longer got the high or the pleasure from it. They used it to
Avoid being sick.
Correct. And what's coming up, and I want is, Hans, I went back to, I wonder if it was like, I enjoyed this so much it really scares me, because I don't know where this could go. Like,
yeah,
the amount of pleasure I am experiencing, or what I like about it, is like, it scares me. And I feel like, Doug, you could really expand on that with your experience. But I have to believe that experiencing pleasure into something that we have innate conflict with can be very scary.
I'm gonna make a nuance here. I don't think it's just the experience of pleasure. Anytime we experience something in life that's a big deal for us, really big deal for us, we are social animals. A really big experience in our life, we are drawn to connect and share with another human being. That is so deeply wired in our brain. It is how we survived as a creature in the jungle. I mean, so there's a very primitive draw when we experience something. Wow, we want to share it. And what do you do with an experience that delivers a fairly reliable wow over and over and over again, and you know it must not be shared?
Yeah.
I think that has a human consequence beyond the fact that it's also just really pleasurable.
I going back, if I may, this brought up something where, and I'll use the analogy, people aren't, like, people say, oh, I'm scared of heights. No one's really truly scared of heights. They're scared of falling, right? And I think when you talk about this porn addiction or porn compulsion or whatever you want, the thing that keeps coming up for me sort of repeatedly is not the act itself, it's the dependency that would occur following. And so going back to my experience, I think there got to be a time where I am one of those guys that just gets on autopilot occasionally. I'll take the wrong freeway exit. I will, do something that is the wrong time, right place, because I'll have these, indicators. And I think for me, it got to a point where, going back to Chrissy's point of maybe it wasn't even pleasurable anymore. It was just sort of autopilot to shame, that like something would happen. And then I didn't know, I didn't like, or it's hard to explain, but do you understand what I'm saying on the top row? Like, did you ever get to that point where, or not even like get to that point, but it wasn't like you were pursuing it for the end goal of this pleasurable experience of orgasm. It was more like, oh, this is happening, and then I'm done, and now I feel, terrible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm bathing in shame.
I'm actually really curious about that experience, Jake, because I know it's probably all three of our experiences with pornography, but I'm wondering if there's contexts where people experience porn without the shame.
Oh, for sure.
And
if
so
you go to other cultures, well, hold on, I'm not an expert.
Yeah.
Okay, Jake, let's see if you can make this about yourself. Is there any time in your entire life story that you remember looking at imagery, masturbating, probably having an orgasm, and you know what? It was a good experience for you, and you left it without recrimination, without shame, and it was just one of those kind of nice days in life. Did you even have it one time on the planet?
Yeah, but it was after I had talked to Chris and after we had communicated. There was no dependency, there was no secrecy, and it still took some time to rewrite the narrative of this is bad, I am bad, this leads to terrible things, right? There's this dependency, like, or whatever else. But like,
so. Wait. Now, can people look at Jake's face? Look at Jake's face when he talks about being able to actually have this experience on the planet without all those chains you talked about. I think men like being what you're saying, Jake. I think men like this.
And I'm just going to hit on a reminder of Jake's having this conversation in front of his partner. I mean, that's significant because that speaks to kind of the ability to be transparent and like it's just open and out and free.
Yeah.
So now I'm having so many questions. I want to there's one thing that I want to hit on that I think is most pressing because I think our audience is probably going to be most concerned about it. And the question is, well, what if pornography is against your moral code? It's not something that you want to have involved in your life. Like, why would I want to get to a place where Jake's at, where, like, if he did want to and he could be open and transparent and talk to his wife about it, like, my experience of porn is that it's really bad and I shouldn't look at it. And so why would I want to get to a place where I could enjoy it without the shame and the guilt? Does that mean something's wrong with me?
So it's really interesting when it becomes a viable option, right? So I had this thing that I'd have to like sneak out and, go to the bathroom or do these things. And it elicited a whole bunch of emotional responses, but mostly I became really tense in my body, and then after our journey and discussing it and getting to the point where it was okay, it was no longer hidden or secretive or shameful, I really started to have to like wrestle with my relationship with pornography in a completely different light, right? And for me, what I noticed was a fundamental tenet in my life is I don't want to cause harm. I don't want to cause harm on anyone else or another being. And that lens, when I overlooked it with sexual imagery, suddenly changed. And I remember Christy started talking to me about ethical pornography or sort of more erotic type thing where I could still get that pleasure that I was seeking without all of... I realized that some of my shame might have been in what I was using or viewing. not because it was like heavy stuff or anything, but just because I was able to start focusing on what and how I was actually consuming, not just trying to run away and, you know,
Right.
and so it kind of put it more on me of, okay, you can do this. You have permission. You've given yourself permission. Now, what are you going to do with it? And then that's when I had to really start to look at it from a value-based perspective and a moral-based perspective in a completely different light. It was no longer everyone else putting their morality and their values on me. It was me now having to take ownership. And that was a really interesting little journey of trying to go through this and suddenly just flipping the narrative on that.
Jake, who did you talk to in this process? Let's go back to Hans and others. There's, in my assumption that this requires interaction with other people to get to where you are. You asked Hans, who would have you talked to back then? Well, who did you talk to? Who were the where were the conversations that helped you navigate this water and get to where you are?
So I am deeply introverted, and a lot of the conversations were with myself in my journal.
Mm-hmm.
Chris would give me wonderful promptings, and she'd be reading a book and she'd be like, oh, there's this fascinating fact, or she was the first person who brought ethical pornography into my lexicon of, oh, that's a thing. And then from there, that's when I started to kind of, and it went so hand in hand with me sort of accepting myself for who I am and how I am, that I didn't really have an outside source. It was more a lot of internal reflection and internal settling, for lack of a better word. When a puddle gets all muddy and the only way for it to sort of become clear is to just let it settle. And a large portion of that, I think, for me was to sort of let this settle of, if I discuss this with my wife, and Nate, I feel like I'm not necessarily doing your question justice of, what if against your morals? Because again, I think it's really easy for us to just jump in and say, this is against my morals, without actually really taking on the ownership, because it's always been forbidden. But if it becomes accessible and it becomes okay, then it really is the true opportunity for you to say, how does this interweave with my morals and with my values? And it takes on a different light. And I think every person's going to be different. And they, hopefully there's a community where they can talk about these things, or people can explore or try on. That is one thing. And then I'll stop talking. I tried on a lot of different views or opinions of how I felt about it. Just to sort of see, like, well, that's not working. What about this? Well, that's not working. What about this? This feels good, but it's not all the way there yet. So I'm going to take a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And that's ultimately how I came with my relationship with sexual imagery or masturbation. It's journeying, it's a process.
Can I just say one thing before we move on? Jake, I hope you understand there are listeners who needed to hear exactly what you said. When we have these conversations, I think it's always this assumption that you're talking to all sorts of all people to get there. I love the fact that you're letting men know some men are like you. And most of this process is internal with themselves and journaling. And that's as viable and as useful as any other process. But you had to have a conversation, but it was through you with journaling. That's important for so many men to hear who are maybe more like you or more introverted. And they think, if the only way I can really look at my relationship with imagery is to go talk to a bunch of other guys, they would overwhelm them.
Yeah.
Right. So I really want to just honor the diversity of the ways in which people find their way through this values clarification.
For sure. And I think I realize that a lot of what you said, knowing the culture that you come from, like, it's a scary thing to just, it can be a scary thing to just own, like, this is the experience that I've gone through to get where I'm at, because it's not necessarily like an approved, or maybe so it's not, maybe it might not be looked on as positively as other paths. But I'm glad that you laid out your path, because I think it offers it as a possibility to other people to follow, to get to a better place. I have a couple more questions, and Hans, you can feel free to chime in on this one as well. do you feel like pornography or sexual imagery, when you were looking at it when it was secret, that the secrecy played a role in it being enticing and kind of fun, and that when you became more transparent with your partner, that a little bit, like Jake mentioned, oh well, now like it's all out on the table and I have to like deal with this myself. Do you feel like looking at that stuff kind of lost its appeal once you started being more transparent with the people in your life? Because I know for me, just speaking for myself, part of the erotic nature of it and the excitement of it is that it was a secret. And sex
therapist Jack Moran calls that the naughtiness factor.
Yeah.
It is taboo.
Something erotic. Yeah, we need something about our sexual life to be a little taboo in order to be it hot and exciting.
Right.
And that's just not for imagery. That's any kind of sexual activity.
And when you come from a background where like taboo doesn't exist, where everything has to be kind of clean and pure and righteous, and maybe this is a need to have that taboo nature, to that corner of your sexuality that's a little bit like risque and naughty. Maybe that's part of the reason why a lot of people do struggle with this, is because they do need that naughty corner of their life. I don't know. I'm totally.
Nate, no, don't dismiss that. You have just said something that I can just tell you. Sex research validates exactly what you just said. So we can just kind of give you the science part of it that says, yeah, that's how human beings work.
And to our audience, there is research that supports that very thing directly out of BYU. Just gives some adding within our own community and culture, that research can hit that.
Now, I realize I asked a question and then answered it for myself, but I'm curious to hear.
Those are the best things, is to find your own questions and then.
I'm jumping in, I guess. Nate, to piggyback on what you were saying and what the conversations with the past few minutes, yeah, I think as a young kid, the taboo nature of it was for sure exciting. Taboo still is exciting when it comes to sexual pleasure for me. With regard to addiction and pornography specifically, and even going back to your previous question about the moral aspect of it, of do I want this in my life? Am I even okay with it? I'll try to speak clearly. There is something about it that I haven't fully unpacked that is interesting to look at. Of once the tension and the conflict gets possibly broken for the first time, like Jake has talked openly about having an initial conversation with Chris about, hey, this is a thing in my life, this is going on, and from there forward the conversation could actually happen. I think that whole moral dilemma that I was going through at a time was prior to ever having space to be able to have any conversation around it. And I think getting to that spot of, okay, I am going to be okay just talking about this and thinking about it and giving it space is a huge first step when it came to my own personal journey moving through porn and the idea of porn addiction.
Hans, do you remember any one thing while you were waiting for that time in your life where you could address it? Is there anything that you remember happening that moved you forward or was really kind of important in eventually getting to that spot?
I don't know if this, so I'll answer your question just with what came to mind. I remember distinctly there were times in my life where I thought, I wish this would get discovered so that I could talk about it with somebody.
Mm.
I wish
wanted to get caught.
I wish I could get caught. And I think behaviors, and I don't know if Jake and Nate, if your experience is the same, behaviors get to a point where you're just less careful or you're more careless, I guess. And eventually you kind of hope someone finds out so that you can have a conversation about it. I don't know if that's what you were asking, Doug, but that is
Hans, if there was a pie chart in front of me with all of the men I've spoken to about what I just asked you, the pie chart would be more than 50% exactly what you just said.
Yeah.
There's no data on this, but I like asking about this because this is what I hear all the time.
Mm-hmm.
The fantasy of it being discovered was the solution you had to your loneliness.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Will you say that again, Doug?
The fantasy of being discovered was your solution to your loneliness.
That rings capital T true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Nick, talk, because you haven't talked about yourself in a bit.
Me?
Yes. Yes, you. You're on the top row.
No, it just rings true. I can resonate with that.
What comes to mind? Yeah.
I'm going to see if I can bring two thoughts together. There was a sense of a part of my experience with pornography growing up was needing to feel right with God. And part of feeling right with God means like confessing your sins. And I didn't have the courage a lot of times to confess my sins. And so there was a part of me that wanted that process to be made easier by somebody just finding out, so that I was forced to have the conversation instead of having to voluntarily offer up the information that was so hard for me. Like, I didn't even know where to start having the conversation. And so I think that was a huge piece for me, is like, how do I get right? How do I get right with God if I don't have the courage to talk about this? Well, the only way that I can get right with God is to have somebody else bring it up or catch me or ask me about it or find out about it, and then kind of like corner me into unburdening this weight that I'm carrying around with me. So that was kind of my lived experience growing up. And I didn't really look at porn until I was in probably my 20s. But that was, well, anyway, the experience is varied, but,
Can I interject? No, if you're not done with your story, you keep going.
well, I mean, I was going to try and kind of overlap this with another question, and we can rewind and visit it. But I want to throw the question out there really quick, and then we can come back and hit it later. But my question is, and I alluded to this when we were talking about Jake, and is it possible to look at porn and not feel like the shame and regret and that heavy weight? And I'm curious if being raised in a religious culture actually makes it more likely for you to consider yourself to be an addict. Like, if being raised in a culture where pornography is bad and terrible, and everybody kind of agrees to the narrative that like this is a gateway drug and it's addictive and it will destroy your life and it will like make you it'll give you like sexual dysfunctions, and it will make you have unrealistic expectations for sex, and it will like destroy your ability to desire and connect with your partner. And it's just a terrible thing. Like, if you're raised in a culture like that, does it make you more likely to have an actual problem with pornography than somebody who's not? Is that?
Well, okay, there's a few things that I just want to sprinkle out there and see where they.
Yeah. So we can come back and revisit that. But
the word that I hear is simultaneously, people, the moment they're born, their sexual development and their identity is beginning. I think there can be a belief that the first time we have the talk with our kids is when their sexual development begins, but it's happening. And that is simultaneously what I see is the development of sexual shame is being interwoven in the sexual development of people. Then you would look at the cultures in which the sexual identity is being formed. And I know Brian Willoughby did do research that spoke to the higher the religiosity, the more someone identifies as a religious person, the more likely they are to identify as an addict.
A porn addict.
What's that?
A porn addict or an addict?
A porn addict. Thank you.
Yeah,
a porn addict.
Mm-hmm.
And there's that's one sprinkle idea. The other sprinkle idea, I think, which would be an unpopular opinion, we haven't gotten back to, why do we need to use the word addict? And I think of the partners. And there's a reason, like, that word can bring safety. Putting another idea out there.
Say more about that. Yeah.
Okay, there's one other idea I just need to sprinkle out is this, to reconcile your relationship with pornography doesn't mean you have to land in a place where you are viewing and consuming sexual imagery. You just have the space to explore that and see where that lands for you, where before you didn't even have space to explore it because it's just bad. So some people, as they develop their own internal value system and their sexual ethic, may go, I don't know if there's a place for this in my life. But that comes from a place of choice. So I want to make it clear that you don't have to land in a place where now you are viewing sexual imagery to not have shame around it. Like, you can have no shame and choose to not participate. Does that make sense?
For sure.
Okay.
I don't want to gloss. You brought up something, you just hinted at it, and we glossed over it too quickly. And I want to dive into it because the three of us on the top row here had a chance to talk about what the word addiction meant to us at the very beginning of the episode, but we haven't considered what the word addiction looks like from the other side of the relationship. And you just alluded at it a little bit, you hinted at it, but if you could take your therapist hat off for just a second and put your wife hat on, when you first started having these conversations about pornography, did the word addiction have any significance to you? Like, what was your experience with it? And
so I want to be clear that I'm putting on Chris the wife hat. Chris the educator hat really wants to be here. But
we had a conversation all about this. So Chris, now you're following.
You can take
our agreement. I love it.
And you can take that wife hat off in just a minute. But I want to hear, because I think there are wives listening who need to hear your experience.
Yeah. Well, I need to go back just a smidge, that when I first got married, there were two things that I was really afraid of. And I was really afraid of, it seemed almost inevitable that I was going to somehow land in a position where I was going to be married to a porn addict. And I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't know what to do about it. But everyone around me, somehow they had been harmed, were continuing to be harmed, lives were ruined because of porn addiction. And I didn't know what to do. And I got very clear with Jake of like, if I ever catch you, that's right. If I ever catch you, like, deal breaker, done. So of course, Jake's treatment plan, or the way he coped with that, is like, well, she'll never find out about that. But, and Hans, I really want to speak to, Jake and I didn't have like a rosy conversation where Jake had done all this work and reconciled his relationship with pornography and said, Chris,
not
part of my life and we should talk about it. He went on a trip and left his computer open.
Yeah.
Because I had the fantasy of getting caught would be the solution to my
loneliness
mess.
Yeah. And he was met with, on a phone. I still remember, I can picture where I was in the foyer of our house. It was a visceral experience for me of calling and being like, what in the hell? And him being like, I'm going to come home. And then I went to the internet, and it was a safe place for me to land because there was a lot of resources. There was a name for it. There was treatment plan, and there was hope. And I even had conversations with family members. I was like, I don't know what to do. Do I leave him? Do I need to shut off all the computers, take away his cell phones? Like, I now became the warden.
Yeah.
That's what that was.
Full mom mode right there.
Everything about it. And I was really disoriented. And Jake and I really didn't know what to do, but the word addiction provided a name. It provided a very clear treatment plan. And it created an outcome, which, like, okay, Jake couldn't help this. He's just an addict. It's not about us. It's not about this is what he wants to do. He just can't help it. And so the wife, for me, there was safety in that. And I advocate for partners when people are like, let's just strip the language of addiction. For a lot of people, that describes their experience. It provides hope. It creates a space of, as long as they're involved in treatment or seeing themselves as an addict, I will no longer be harmed, or there's some safety in that because they're in a container of accountability. And now they're in a container of accountability with the church, with a treatment center, with a therapist. And this is where wives, I think, can get really caught, is now they have to be accountable to me. And
Can I bring this full circle before we move on? Notice how that entire list, Kristen, the whole, you did it beautifully, did not include what are we going to do with the pleasure?
no,
You know, that the response and the word addiction moves the conversation immediately to it's all about safety. It's all about safety. But sexual health is a balance of safety and pleasure. So
Yep.
because of the circumstances, and you know, of course, that's a human response. But notice how the addiction label moves the conundrum of what to do with the pleasure. You know, it's completely out of the question. So, like I love what you said. It's not about us, and it's not about this is actually something maybe my partner really likes. You know, that gets to be kind of dissolved in the, oh no, we have an addiction in our family now.
and that word gave the word, I would say, and I think this is where trying to expand the possible language around what that experience could be is tricky, because addiction gave my experience legitimacy. It really illustrated of just how bad and what we're really struggling with and what we're up against. I think it's the same thing with betrayal and betrayal trauma. Betrayal in and of itself, and I'm not going to hijack that.
Right, of course, that's very real.
Betrayal trauma, adding that additional word somehow creates a different kind of legitimacy. But when you really look at betrayal is one of the most painful, difficult feelings to reconcile on its own. But anyway, so
what this conversation's really about today, if I were to make a summary, addiction gives everything we've talked about here a legitimate solution to have a conversation. It's an avenue. It provides so many human needs, but it doesn't mean it's accurate. It provides legitimacy, but it doesn't mean it provides accuracy.
Oh, I like
what's
that.
actually going on.
Yes.
So sorry, Jake, I can see you've been wanting to say something. I'm going to let you go.
It's just a quick antidote that when Chris discovered my computer when I was on that trip, our relationship now is based off of understanding. But at that time, it was, you are this. We didn't talk about what I was looking at. We didn't talk about how often. We didn't talk about any of those things. There was no curiosity around it to understand it. It was, you are now an addict. This is what you need to do. And I think that is one of the critical missteps. Well, I think that's one of the things that hindered our progress more than anything else in the whole thing, was not sitting down and then having the start of many conversations of what, why, how, those type of things, so that we could both really understand.
Yeah.
But we were in a different...
You weren't the only one that got, I then had a new identity.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I was the wife of an addict.
Yeah, you were the betrayed partner.
Yeah.
I didn't even have the language of betrayed. I just was the wife of an addict. And
which was the terror of terrors for you.
Yeah, it was. Everything came true.
A married person. That was the terror you heard all about.
Yeah, and it came true. Like it happened, and now I'm the wife of an addict. And but yeah. Anyway, yes. So I'm looking at the time, and I don't want to keep talking.
We have 12 minutes left, and Doug just brought up, I think, the crux of the conversation, which is legitimacy and validity doesn't equal accuracy. So what does accuracy look like?
Accuracy is what's been happening in this room. If you want accurate information about someone's relationship with sexual imagery and the conflicts and the worries and look at all the human dilemmas that you've talked about so honestly. These are real human dilemmas. These are not to be underestimated. And notice how the dilemmas are different at each stage of life. So these are all human and important stories. But so the alternative is we have to look at how it is we create systems that aren't upset with the fact that we don't have places to talk about this. Why aren't we upset about that? Han's story. We'll go back, and viewers haven't heard it, but go back and look at the previous episode of Han's story of his watching this movie with his family, and his son being able to openly discuss at a very 8 years old or something, that his body's having a physiological response and he's getting an erection, and he could speak to his father about it while it was happening, watching some movie. I mean, there's a vision of an alternative. And I love what Kristen said. The dilemmas you were all in as men was formed at a much earlier age, around the shame around sexuality. And so that one story that Hans shared with us so beautifully is part of the image of what the alternative is. Jake's alternative, it was years and years later that he found an alternative. Hans, years and years later. But notice the alternative is difficult, long conversations, painful, honesty, facing values conflicts, really sharing what gives us pleasure in our life, choosing to no longer be exploitive in our relationships as a solution to these dilemmas. These are not easy things to do.
I'm going to pull a Doug here. You used the word exploitative. Exploitive. Will you explain to our audience what that word means? Because I don't think I fully know what that means.
Well, exploitive illiteracy is one of the biggest problems in this country, because exploitation is a human behavior we do every day. And we just all go about as if it doesn't happen unless it's the most egregious, severe form of exploitation you could ever imagine. And that's like saying I only eat pizza when I eat 30 in one sitting. It's like, I mean, come on.
Terrible.
Sometimes you have a slice of pizza, but you're still like pizza. So exploitation is the same thing. Exploitation gets a bad rap, like it's a terrible, 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 terrible thing. And it's a human behavior. And what it is, we have some information, which is power. Information is power. I have information that I am not going to let you know. And I'm going to convince you that the some other information is actually true. And I'm going to act as if that other information is actually true. And when I get you to believe that it's actually true, I'm not going to contradict you. I'm going to let you go along thinking it's true. Now, no, we don't pollute the air. We just drive cars. Right. I mean, it is, we take advantage. We use situations for our own gain. That's a human behavior, and we have to get over ourselves that it's a condemnation.
Doug, can you give an example of exploitation with pornography or sexual imagery? Like when you say, I have information.
Yeah. I watch these images and I like them.
You have what?
I watch these images. I enjoy it. I'm incredibly conflicted about it. I feel ashamed of it, but I still watch it, and I want you to know. Let's talk about it.
And what would the opposite of, give it an exploitative?
Every time Jake put down the computer and walked into and had dinner with you and never said a word about what he had just been doing, allows the impression that, of course, no imagery is in this house.
Okay.
Right. So when I worked with men in OCSB, when I was a therapist, I loved asking men after they had not kept their relationship agreement and they were next with their partner. What was your strategy to make sure your partner didn't know you just did not keep the agreement? What did you do? How did you say? Why did you behave? Because those first 3 or 4 minutes are the whole strategy for exploitation.
That's an interesting conversation to have as a couple.
Yeah.
What's your strategy? You mentioned, right?
Everybody has one, and the partner has one too, by the way. Yep. Everybody has a strategy.
You mentioned OCSB. Will you just clear up really quick what that is?
That's my word for the human behavior we're talking about here today, which is out of control sexual behavior, which is not an addiction, and it's not a psychosexual or a mental illness or an addictive disorder. It's a human behavior problem. We don't call affairs a disease or a disorder or a syndrome. It's a human behavior. So out of control sexual behavior is a human behavior. That is a big problem. It's a big problem. Yes. But it's not a disorder. It's not a diagnosable condition. It's not an addictive disorder.
What's the difference?
Oh.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Kristen. No. That's the piece what?
No, I just was going to say, I think that's where people though can feel like it's less than. Like addiction is real, and this is for the real serious cases. But OCSB, out of control sexual behavior, that's somehow letting it off the hook.
Why
And-
is it? Yeah. Sorry, I keep cutting you off. I'm just
No,
going to
you're fine.
myself.
Go ahead.
I want to make sure, because we're kind of stepping into psychobabble a little bit,
Uh-huh.
that we have a little bit of clarity for our audience here. And why is it important to distinguish between addiction or a problem or some sort of like you called it a I don't even remember the words you used, but
Psychosexual disorder.
yeah,
Oh, yeah, I'm
psychosexual
sorry.
disorder.
I got into my little inside baseball as a therapist. I'm sorry.
No, it's great. It introduced the conversation.
That's where those sentences live, and that's how they come out.
But my job in this is to make sure that we're extrapolating a little bit so that people who don't have that knowledge, that background, can be on the same page. So why is that an important distinction to make between a psychosexual problem, a disorder, and just a problem?
Because when you go to the doctor and you think you have cancer, and they tell you, guess what? You don't have cancer, but you've got a growth there on your skin, and we're going to deal with it. But it's not cancer. We're relieved, but nonetheless, they got something they got to deal with, because they got to deal with the skin disorder, right? So knowing the difference and the distinction between when something's actually a real disease and a condition is important for us, because it means how we have to treat it and what we have to do about it and what the prognosis. Diseases to call something a disease is powerful, incredibly powerful, and has deep meaning for people. The dilemma is there is no agreement anywhere that porn and the use of sexual imagery can become an addictive process. We have no agreement.
Meaning a disease.
Yeah, a disease, right? Addiction is it's a disorder. It's a disease. Once you go into this area of addiction, you've crossed a threshold, and you have like the equivalent of a disorder that actually is diagnosable and needs certain ways of being treated. This is important. But the use of sexual imagery has never been established in any conclusive manner at all to be a kind of an addictive process. Now, there are people who think it is. Mm-hmm. But that does, people can think all sorts of things. That's okay. But there isn't a consensus agreement. You know what? There's this issue with looking at imagery, and we call it porn addiction, and we've all kind of settled on it that it's an actual real deal. We've settled on cancer. We don't debate whether cancer is a real deal anymore. But there is complete no agreement on the idea that porn, and the use of sexual imagery, can actually become a human addictive process. There's just no agreement on this whatsoever.
But can it become or is it a very big problem? Absolutely. Yeah. And this kind of circles back to the very beginning of there's some beautiful imagery of it. Can feel like you can feel extraordinarily so out of control. It can be disrupting your work. It can be disrupting your home life. It can be disrupting everything, that it must be an addiction. Otherwise, why would anybody choose this? What the OCS, looking at it from an out of control sexual behavior model, allows us to dig deep and be very curious about what is it that's contributing to you continuing to make these choices that are so disruptive in your life. And my experience is when it's limited to an addiction, then we stop the curiosity.
Yeah, and we go right to
into managing that behavior to tend to all of the fallout in life, and that, so it still is attending to, this is a problem.
Yes, it is.
But let's take the time to really explore what this is about, so there can be true accountability to it, versus people in the out of control sexual behavior. There can be a level of accountability and having to go even explore exploitation, uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. But there's room to look at that.
Yeah.
I have to go. I know we're live in that thing, but
that's okay. We need to wrap up. So if you need to jump off. I will summarize really quick, unless somebody else wants to summarize what just went down.
Well, I want to throw a thought in, Nate.
Okay, go ahead.
Chris, good to see you. If you need to take off.
I will listen for one more minute.
Just to put my layman's experience, an experiential accounting of what Doug was talking about with the idea of moving away from the idea of addiction to something more accurate. I heard Doug and Kristen both use the word accuracy a couple of times. The thought that kept coming to mind for me is that when I finally started having conversations, both internally, like Jake did with his journal with himself, conversations with myself, and conversations with my partner, I was in a relationship, I started to move towards, I'm going to use the word alignment. And I started to align my pleasure that I was having with my morals, with my relationship, with my church, with all of the different factors in my life that had been causing extreme conflict until I started to have those conversations to move towards alignment and accuracy of what this is. It was me using sexual imagery for pleasure that I really enjoyed, and I couldn't talk about that. And when we finally started to move from me avoiding it, past the definition of me being an addict, to a place where we could have some conversation and figure out how those things do or don't align, that's when things started to change completely for me. And when I finally felt like I started to have some hope around sexual imagery and the use of porn or sexual imagery or pleasure in my life. I might have taken away from how we were wrapping up before then.
Oh, Hans, that was spot on, Hans.
Yep.
I love the story you just told. I went from avoidance to the identity of addiction,
Yeah.
to what I call, I moved into sexual health conversations. Which sexual health conversations are about aligning values, aligning your principles, aligning who you want to be as a sexual being on the planet with all of the relationships and institutions that matter to you.
Yeah.
You know, and so that's a sexual health conversation versus aligning with an addiction treatment process.
And it's moving towards something, not just away from something. And Doug, there's another part, sexual health conversations, but I think you would say, Hans, you've started to develop your vision for sexual health.
Thank you, Kristen.
Yes.
Your vision for sexual health. And
And
I
we'll
love that I love your vision of sexual health, Hans, was not one of being alone.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks for summarizing that better than I think I did myself.
No. I only got to summarize it, but you described it so well.
I appreciate it. Yes, that a vision of sexual health and alignment of my morals, relationships, and those institutions around me has become a much better place to operate and live in than avoiding or than being an addict. And and I would love it if we can share that with people here that are listening or that are around us also.
Well, we're going to keep having these sexual health conversations. And I hope that I love this conversation. Thank you all.
Yeah.
And Kristen, who just bounced. This was one of my favorites that we've had so far. I'm really glad that everybody showed up and shared your stories and your thoughts and your experiences. And it makes me really excited for next week. So for those of you who are tuning in, if you want more information, maybe this is the first episode you've listened to, you can go to rethinkingpornaddiction.com, where you can find a link to our Facebook group or our YouTube page. We're working on putting this in podcast format as well. We'll give you an announcement when that happens. But thank you for joining us in this conversation. And as always, you're welcome to submit your questions, and we invite you back next week to participate in another sexual health conversation where hopefully we can continue to model what it looks like to have these deeply nuanced, difficult, emotionally challenging, but really productive and really important conversations that center around the topic of pornography. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, you guys.
Thanks, everyone.